it is extremely important for us to understand what exactly depression is in terms of mental health. And it is characterized as a mental health disorder that involves persistent depressed moods and loss of general interest in all your activities. And it's not the same as just being sad. So I hope that that's something that's very clear. It's something I'm going to cover during this Zoom meeting, that being depressed and being sad are two very different things. And the reason why I want to emphasize on this is because when I'm going through the rest of the meeting, I would like all of us to be on the same page as to the severity of depression and how exactly it causes significant impairment in our daily life. So, for example, I can give one example is, let's say, you're studying really hard and you're failing your exams and you're really struggling to actually study and to make it and everything, and maybe you're sad because you have failed your exams. Now that is so that is the definition of being sad. Whereas when you're depressed, there is a constant feeling of that sadness. So not just in the moment are you sad, but you are going to be sad throughout the day. You're going to be sad the next day. You're going to be sad for the coming weeks. Now, with this sadness and loss of interest that's characterized as depression, there are a lot of behavioral and physical symptoms as well, which I will cover later on in the meeting. And so depression can be associated with, major changes in your life. So when you're depressed, it is very different from being sad, because when you're sad, it is an emotion that is felt by human beings in the moment. Whereas when you're depressed, it is something that you are going to feel when you're sleeping. It is something that's going to show you in signs of physical symptoms, and more so it's going to change your daily behavior. So first and foremost, I wanted to just explain that. I hope everybody is following me so far. Okay, I'm just checking to see if you're all replying, so you're following. Okay, yes, you can be sending the questions on the chat, and you can also ask me, or just feel free to tell me to give you a minute. So I just wanted to first explain that I myself, I've been through quite a few turmoils in life in the past, and due to the loss of my parents, both of them, and major changes in my life, I have also experienced a few symptoms of depression. And I think that's what puts a person in a better position to be explaining what it is and how you feel and what exactly you go through when you say that you are depressed. I personally, thank you guys. I personally managed to overcome that though, and I think it's because there are some people who are more resilient, I guess, to the turmoils that come in life, and I saved myself from entering this depression because I understood the importance of managing it before it turned into major depression. So yeah, that's the first. Sorry, could you guys mute your yeah, the sounds. Okay. So yeah, that's just the beginning of how I got into mental health. More importantly, I also got into mental health and focused a lot on depression because I noticed it is a trending topic in the world. People tend to misunderstand what depression is. People tend to not even understand the signs of when you're depressed, and there's a lack of understanding in terms of the symptoms, management, and differentiating depression from general anxiety. So we're going to focus on all of that. I also wanted to mention that I have dealt with multiple clients that have, proper and full depression. So there's a disorder called major depression. And in major depression, you feel all kinds of changes in your life, mainly because there are changes in your brain function that come with being depressed. So one of the biggest myths in relation to depression is that it's just something you're feeling, but it's really not just that. There is a great depth of depression, and that comes from your mental brain function. It includes altered activity of certain neural circuits in the brain. So being depressed is not something that you are just imagining. It's not something that you wake up one day and decide that you're going to feel. Being depressed is actually a disorder that's in the DSM-5, which means that it is a medical disorder. So having major depression is not something that you should be taking lightly, because there are medications, there's therapy, and most importantly, there are changes that are going to happen in your brain that will affect your daily life, your physical health as well. So there is a lot of changes in cognitive abilities as well that is caused by major depression. I've seen that as a question by Crystal, who's asking, is loss of IQ and change in cognitive abilities a change in the brain caused by major depression? And yes, because there are things in your brain that is changing, you are going to feel persistent symptoms that will alter your concentration levels. And when your concentration levels are altered, you also end up not being able to function cognitively to the best of your own abilities. So I hope that answers Crystal's question. Yeah, so first and foremost, I just wanted to mention just a small introduction of that depression. Now, moving on, I also would like to define what anxiety is. I hope we're all following. Is that okay? Could I start with just defining anxiety? Okay. So anxiety is basically your body's natural response to being stressed. So it is a feeling of overwhelming fear or apprehension about what is going to come. So you can feel normal anxiety, which is, it's the first day of school, or I'm about to speak in front of a group. Those kind of things will cause general and regular anxiety that people will feel. However, having anxiety disorder is much different, because when you have anxiety disorder, much like depression, it is going to have physical, mental, emotional effects on your life. And it's going to be felt with intense, excessive, persistent worry and fear about everyday situations. Not just major things that you're supposed to be nervous about, but it is going to cause you anxiety in small things. So I'm sure people have friends and they're like, oh, this is causing me so much anxiety. Now, with generalized anxiety disorder, it is being in a constant state of fear. It's like every time you want to do something, imagine your brain telling you, you can't do this, or what happens if you do this? This is what's going to happen if you do it. And it's like your brain giving you all the negatives of anything. So that's what anxiety is. There's rapid heart rate, there's rapid breathing, there's sweating, there's feeling of being constantly tired. And all those symptoms are very similar to the ones that you would feel when you're depressed. So I hope we're following up until now. I just saw Mary's is having suicide thoughts. All right, so I will answer all the questions after the introduction, but I just want to know if everyone is following. So just to recap one more time, depression is one illness, and it has a lot of different symptoms, and it feels very different to different people. So this means that one person can be depressed and another person can be depressed, but you are not going to have the same symptoms. You are also not going to understand the differences. It's so easy for someone to say, oh, she's waking up, she's going to work, she's going to school, she's meeting her friends, so she's not depressed. But what people don't understand is that depression is something that's caused within the mind. And as much as you have to, follow your daily routine, depression will cause other effects. So you don't know what's happening when this person is at school, or you don't know what's happening when this person is at work, So depression doesn't have the same face, and everyone wears a different mask when they're depressed. Anxiety, on the other hand, is a larger term that encompasses a range of feelings that are related to fear mainly. So with anxiety, you end up feeling discomfort because of an anticipated consequence that may or may not actually exist. So that is the difference between having anxiety and having depression. I think I will pass over the room to Nish just so she can guide me on what else you guys would like to hear. Nish?
Okay, Maru, there is a question here. Is having suicidal thoughts a result of depression? Maybe you can explain to us about suicidal thoughts.
Yes, I can. So, being suicidal or having suicidal thoughts is actually one of a very common symptom of having depression. And this is because when you're depressed, the brain, isn't looking at things the way you normally would. So your last resort is, to commit suicide. And I'm going to keep my explanations as simple as possible, just so that everybody can follow exactly what I'm saying. The risk of, death by suicide is related to the severity of depression, mainly because when you're depressed, a lot in your life doesn't feel like it's going right. And when you enter major depression, there is no sign of hope. Usually before people even enter therapy or even go for therapy, they have deep feelings of loss, grief, fear, sadness, and it becomes so overwhelming that sometimes they resort to wanting to commit suicide. And that's why okay. However, I also want to point out that suicide does not always happen because you're depressed. There is a very strong correlation between the two, but there is also a very big difference, because you can have suicidal thoughts, but up until the time you were ready to up until the time you were actually feeling like, okay, I need to kill myself, it takes a very deep and long journey to actually reach there and say something like that. So you must have been depressed for a very long time, you know to be able to think of suicide. So yes, it is extremely correlated to each other. And when you're depressed, it is very hard to avoid those feelings, because you usually feel like you've just reached the end of the tunnel. You feel like there's no going out of this dark tunnel. There's no light at the end of this tunnel. So what happens then? That's the thought that comes into people's minds when they're depressed. So I hope that answers the question. Nish?
Yes, yes, I hope that question is answered. Okay, something else we would like to know is, when you talk about anxiety, we base it more on it's caused by stress, and we graduate from anxiety to get to depression. So when you're talking about anxiety, how well can we manage that?
So you want to talk about managing anxiety, right?
Yes.
Okay. So when it comes to having anxiety, I have multiple friends actually, and one of the things that I always tell them, and many of my friends, I even did my thesis based on anxiety and the effects that you having anxiety has on other people. Now, the first thing you need to know with anxiety is, before you want to manage anxiety, it is extremely important to understand what triggers your anxiety. It is impossible to know how to manage something when you don't know its cause. And in therapy and when you're a counselor, that's the first thing that we're taught is anything that you feel has a cause to it. And there are multiple anxiety triggers. There is things like health issues. Sometimes this one type of trigger is very powerful because it produces immediate personal feelings about your own health and yourself. For example, right now with coronavirus, it's so easy to have someone who's not even a person who has anxiety. For example, myself, I don't have general anxiety when it comes to my life. I'm blessed in the sense that a lot of things don't trigger fear and stress, and I think that comes with what you're going through. So it reaches a point where sometimes something like corona can cause anxiety, such a trigger. So right now I'm on edge. I'm worried about where I'm going. I'm worried about what I'm doing. If I fall even a bit sick, I'm like in full panic mode. I've even given myself fevers because I've overthought so much. Now, that in itself, just the idea. So I know now, yeah, that, okay, the fact that there's a global pandemic is exactly what is causing my anxiety. So because I know the trigger, I know that I can manage this by being logical. I know how I can manage it. So that was just an example I wanted to give you so you understand why it's very important to understand the triggers of your anxiety. Another point I want to make is that when you have anxiety, um, as youth, there's a lot going on in the world. And I've noticed, and like when you research about anxiety, you'll see that it's the youth who have very high levels of anxiety in the world right now. And that is because things are getting harder, the times are getting harder, emotions are being felt more, people are more even open about how they're feeling. So therefore, anxiety rates have increased because truly, I believe that, the world is getting to be a harder place to live in. So you have to really focus on what triggers your anxiety. Is it your health issues? Is it your food? Is it negative thinking? Is it your financial concerns? Are you anxious when you think about social events? Are you anxious because of conflict? So all these things are very important. And when you have a person who has anxiety in your life, there are ways to handle them. So first of all, I want to say that it's very important to respect the person who has anxiety or depression because um sorry, there's just a question here. Let me refer to that question because it's in direct relation to what I'm saying. The question is asking what happens when you don't understand what triggers your anxiety. Now, when you don't understand what triggers it, it's very important to speak to somebody. And this is why we have counselors. So I have friends who have social anxiety, right? But they don't know particularly which scenarios are going to cause them anxiety. They don't understand that if there's a certain situation they're about to go in, they feel anxious. Now, I, as a counselor, because they're my friends, I'm able to see this. So I know that they end up having anxiety attacks and panic attacks you when I'm going to introduce them to new people or when I'm going to take them to a new place. So I could tell them that this is what's triggering your anxiety. Because if all day you're not anxious, but this one particular situation that is occurring all the time is causing you anxiety, that's the first step in figuring out what triggers your anxiety. Like for me, I've been really anxious for the past 2 or 3 months. And I kept worrying about why am I so anxious? What is wrong with me? There is it's not like me to feel anxious. That's the thing. So I sat down to self analyze, and that's what you do when you have anxiety. You sit there and you think, what is the pattern? When am I most stressed? So I noticed it's when I'm outside and I'm feeling hot and I'm feeling overwhelmed because everyone is checking your temperature and you have to wash your hands 6 times a day. I noticed that it's exactly in those situations when I'm feeling the most anxious. So when you follow there's always a pattern to what triggers your anxiety. There's also things that cause anxiety that are just physical objects. There are people who see clusters. It's like having a phobia of like clusters of small circles. Something like that can trigger anxiety in a person. So it's something that's always going to be reoccurring, and that's extremely important to understand. Um, Another thing I want to mention is the symptoms of anxiety. And the reason I want to mention that is because you can't manage something, again, like I said, unless you know that you have it. So most of the common symptoms of anxiety include one, which is what everybody feels immediately, is uncontrollable worry. Another one is fear. So you'll feel like a sensation of, like something's in your stomach, or you'll feel something in your throat, or you'll feel a kind of panic that you can't explain, but it's physically felt, within your body. There are also signs of having, okay, your heartbeat is most likely going to increase very rapidly, and you'll probably feel very flushed. You will also have, in general, difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, restlessness, as well as physical discomfort such as tingling and feeling pits in your stomach or irritability, and even physical aspects like you'll see your legs shaking nonstop. So those are the main symptoms of having anxiety. And yeah, a lot of things can cause anxiety. I've even seen someone else's comment saying that they get anxious when they're broke. Now these are things that you will notice, but it's very important to understand if you have an anxiety disorder or if you're just feeling anxious because something isn't going right. So many times, people will just assume they have anxiety disorder. But sometimes that's not always the case, because what happens with anxiety disorder is that you have a very, very generalized feelings of anxiety when you have this disorder. That means that it's overwhelming to a point that even things that shouldn't be giving you anxiety are going to give you anxiety. So the difference between having a disorder is that having a disorder means it's going to take over your whole life. And when you're just anxious about something because it's temporary worry, that's also different. And I believe that that's how anxiety starts. Not just me, but obviously there's theories, psychological theories that have proven when you focus on your irrational thoughts in those moments of stress, you are most likely going to cause yourself to have anxiety. Because what happens is when you're not able to manage the small stresses in your life, like Nish said, it builds up into a pyramid and you end up, um, it's like what I always say is it's like a banana peel. If you eat a banana and you throw the banana peel in the room and you don't throw it away, after some time, the stench is going to be very overwhelming. So it's the same thing with anxiety. If you don't throw away that in the beginning, it's going to eventually take over your whole life. So those are just the symptoms I've covered, I believe, and just explaining how to identify your triggers. So I want to just answer a few questions before I continue with managing of anxiety, just because I want everybody to be on the same page and not have questions on their head while I'm speaking. Is that okay? Okay, so I'm just going to start from the beginning. There's a question here by Jillian, and she's asked, other than depression, major depression, what are the other types of depression? So I'm going to just do an overview of the major types of depression that exist in the world right now. Obviously, this has changed over time, but I would just like to cover the 9 major types of depression that we have. So like I said, the first one is major depression. Now, with major depression, it's also called, sorry, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Seemrun.
Okay, sorry, I just, my microphone had come off, okay. So for major depression, it's basic classic depression. It's very common in most people, and almost 16.5 million adults in just the US have at least experienced one major depressive episode. So with just that, you can tell how large it is. Now, people with major depression have symptoms every single day. It has very little to do with what's actually happening around you. Like I said, you can have an amazing job, you can have friends, you can have family, but you can still have depression nonetheless. So there's that. Major symptoms of major depression include constant feelings of grief and sadness. There is difficulty sleeping. There is lack of appetite. There is loss of appetite. There is unexplained physical aches and pains. There is also loss of interest in formerly enjoyed activities. So all of a sudden you notice, okay, I used to love reading, I used to love going out, I used to love, swimming, but now it's like nothing matters anymore, And there's a lack of concentration, memory problems, and the inability to make decisions. Now, I want to focus on that mainly for just a few seconds because someone had asked, does it affect your cognitive abilities? Yes, major depression does, because when you're depressed, there is a lack of serotonin levels in your brain. That means that there are certain things in your brain that are not going to cause you happiness anymore. And therefore, your brain wants to shut out the things that are bad, you can say. So because our brain is addicted and always wants more of anything that makes us feel good, when that feeling stops, you can say that you're depressed. Because now your brain, those levels have gone so far down that you no longer want anything, you no longer care about anything. And if you don't care about something, it's most likely not going to stay in your memory. So that's very important to understand. There's also feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, major drop in your self-esteem, and eventual thoughts of death, self-harm, and suicide. Now, major depression has to last over weeks and even months before you can actually say that you've had an episode of major depression. Um, the second one is persistent depression. I'm not going to focus a lot on this because it is a lot like major depression, but persistent depression lasts for 2 years or more. So it's also known as chronic depression, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. And it doesn't feel as intense as major depression, but the problem with that is it prolongs over too long of a time. So over an amount of like 2 or 3 years, you may not even realize you're depressed, but these symptoms slowly start creeping in. So you have concentration issues, changes in your sleep pattern, appetite changes, lack of interest, social withdrawal. You can't function at work and school. So something you thought you could, you were very good at, and you realize 2 years down the line that you have been depressed for this long. So that's what persistent depression is. Another kind of depression is bipolar disorder. Now, bipolar disorder is also a disorder on its own. And manic depression or bipolar disorder consists of small periods where you feel very happy and then you have episodes of being really, really sad. Now, the common name for this is bipolar. So it's called bipolar because you're feeling two polar opposite ends of emotions within a short amount of time. So you can have an episode of mania, which is happiness, and it can last for 7 days. And what happens with that is you'll be on such a high that it's like being on drugs. Your brain, happy chemicals will be so extreme that you're not even going to think of what you're doing. You will just all of a sudden have crazy happiness emotions. And why is your body doing that? Your body is doing that because it's trying to fight off the depressive episodes. And the depressive episodes include feelings of sadness, lack of complete energy. So it's basically like you're just going to sleep in bed all day. You may not even be asleep, but you're just not able to move. You have trouble concentrating, you don't want to do anything. So what happens is some of these episodes, they end up causing hallucinations and delusions. And when you reach that level, you know that it's extremely, extremely mentally tiring on your body. So that's why it is classified as depression. Um, there is also depressive psychosis, and psychosis is basically when you lose touch with reality. So this kind of depression is extremely, extremely medical and very medically related, because when you have to treat something like that, you have to include medication, because medication is what's going to help you take care clinically of your psychosis. What happens with psychosis is you have hallucinations, you have delusions, and alongside that, you also have major depression, sorry. Moving on, there's also perinatal depression, which is basically it happens during pregnancy or within 4 weeks of childbirth. It's also called postpartum depression, which is the common name for it. And this is very, very common. People think that, you've given birth and you're just miserable about it. People don't understand that it is actually a clinically diagnosed type of depression. And it applies to depression that happens during pregnancy and immediately after pregnancy. So because of the hormonal changes that happen in your body, it triggers the changes in the brain chemicals, which then lead to extreme mood swings. And on top of that, the whole idea of, lack of sleep, taking care of your child, physical discomfort, having a newborn, you end up feeling, emotions of sadness, anxiety. And what I've also noticed is the whole topic of postpartum depression, people really like to overlook it, but what they don't realize is in this little time, it can really affect the parent-child relationship, which has very long-term effects on the child. So this is something that I think the youth should be really focusing on, teaching especially younger mothers about postpartum depression and making sure that they manage and handle that really well. There'll also be, episodes of panic, extreme worry about your child, and then eventual difficulty of even caring about yourself. And the worst, I think, symptom of this type of depression is there are thoughts of self-harm or harming the baby. And that's why it's very important to focus on this kind of depression, especially when it's depression with the youth. And then there is something also commonly known as PMS, which is premenstrual syndrome. Premenstrual syndrome is basically physical and psychological, and it's very severe because women feel very emotional in the days that lead up to their period. So you feel cramps, bloating, tenderness, headaches, mood swings, food cravings, lack of energy. And this is also because of hormonal changes. So when I talk of depression, it's very important that people realize that having any one of these kind of depressive episodes or having any kind of depression is very clinical. And it is not supposed to be taken lightly, because when you are depressed, people will be like, okay, go out, you'll feel better, or take a vacation, you'll feel better. But that's not going to help, because in the long term you find that depression has come from a very deep rooted issue, and even sometimes it can just come because there are changes in your brain. So you have to go visit a clinic, and you have to see a therapist, because you have to find out what factors are causing your depression. So I'm going to let Nish ask me the questions so I can be answering them. I hope that answers the types of depression, and I hope we all learned something about depression.
Okay, Maru,
Yeah.
you talked about us identifying the triggers.
Oh,
So we have a question here. What if your triggers are things that you can't change? So how do you deal with that? If they're the things that you can't change totally, do we adapt to being resilient, or how do we handle this?
okay. So I have actually, this is a very good question, because it will also help me cover some of the ways to manage anxiety. So there's something that there are 4 strategies, I believe, of managing anxiety. And these are very easy to remember. I have so many clients, like I told you, and friends that have anxiety and depression and stress. So these methods, I call them the 4 A's. And I learned about these 4 A's quite a long time ago from one of my own therapists, because as a counselor, you have to go through therapy yourself. And I did a lot of research on it, because I found that they were very effective methods. So perhaps, I think this would interest everybody, because it's very easy to remember. So the 4 A's include avoid,
See
alter,
what you're selling.
accept, and adapt. Sorry, could you guys perhaps mute your mic? Thank you. So yes, like I said, it's avoid, alter, accept, or adapt. Now, in relation and in answer to your question, when you can't change something and you go to a therapist, such as myself, and I teach you these methods, you will have to choose the one. You see, because what happens with life is most of the times we can't change something. So for example, you have anxiety because someone is unwell, and that is not in your hands, right? Sometimes you have anxiety because of something that you absolutely do not have control over. Someone's coming to meet you, or you have to be somewhere, or something that is just completely unavoidable, right? So when you find that something cannot be avoided, we would say you will either alter, you will either accept, or you will either adapt. Now, the reason why I say those things is because out of those 4 things, in every situation where you find yourself having anxiety or stress, you will also use one of these 4 methods to manage it. And one of these methods is always applicable. And that's why I think that these 4 methods of handling anxiety are extremely important, but they're also very overlooked. So in that situation, what you can do in such a time is, when it comes to the method of alteration, it's basically trying your best to change the situation. Whereas you don't sometimes have to change what's happening, but you can change how people are reacting towards that. You can alter your reactions to it. You can alter your behavior to it as well. So that's very important to remember. If you're going to use acceptance, there's some times where, as human beings, you're not allowed, and you have no choice but to accept how things are. For example, if someone dies, there's nothing you can do about it. Now, what happens when someone dies? A lot of things change, especially if it's a person that is close to you, especially if it's a caregiver. For example, me, when my mom passed away, it took a lot of mental change, because you have to get used to a life that you're not used to. And what happens in that situation? It's extremely important to understand that you can use acceptance, talking to somebody, forgiving the situation, practicing positive self talk, learning from your mistakes, and more importantly, just looking at the positive aspect of what has happened, because you cannot change it. But you also don't want to sit there and suffer with the anxiety. So I hope that answers that question. Nish?
Yes, the next question is, there is one who's asking, can medication help in managing depression? And with this question, maybe you can merge it with the treatment of depression. You can talk about antidepressants and the psychotherapy.
Okay. So in clinical depression and in clinical depression is basically same as major depression or any kind, but it reaches a point where you have to use medication. Now, what happens with antidepressants is that when you have medication, you're also supposed to have talk therapy. This is because these treatments will normalize the brain changes that are associated with the depression. So there are different kinds of antidepressants, and based on the diagnosis that you're going to be given is how they're going to even give you the medication. So one of the things that I've come to find is, you know, when you're a counselor, you have to accept the fact that there is medications to help you. Now, what happens with antidepressants? Basically, there are side effects, of course, and it also does not help everyone. So only about 30% of people who have depression go into full remission after taking the first course. So there was a study done a few years ago, and they said that the ones who got better were the ones that were taking these medications for a longer period of time. Some antidepressants will work better for certain individuals, and some of them, it just won't work. Sometimes you need more than one medication as well. But yes, there is medication and antidepressants that are taken to treat depression. Antidepressants, however, carry a warning about increased risk compared to just talking therapy and other kinds of drugs for suicidal thinking and behavior in children. So you'll notice that's why, like, you can't just go and say, I want an antidepressant and then decide to have it yourself. You need to be clinically diagnosed in order to have that. So when you're working with your doctor, you know, you have to combine it with psychotherapy, which is what people would optionally go for first. The reason why you go for psychotherapy first is because you have to see if you can get to the root of the problem, to see if talk therapy is going to help this person get out of the depression. You don't immediately, as a counselor, I won't get someone depressed and immediately think of medication for them. So yeah, that's extremely important to know. Another thing with depression is that there are a lot of types of psychotherapy techniques that counselors use based on why people are depressed. So I don't know if you want me to continue with that, or shall we answer the questions?
Maybe you can finish up with that, and then you will answer the rest of the questions later.
Okay, so there's no more related questions, right?
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. So in terms of counseling, psychotherapy, first of all, let me just help you define it. Psychotherapy involves a variety of techniques that we use. A person with depression will talk to a mental health care professional who is trained. And what we do as counselors is to help the person to identify and work through the factors that are triggering depression. Like I said, it is very important to always look at the root of your issues first. And just as a side note, I would also like to say that even in your daily life, you know, when you feel moments of anger, when you feel moments of sadness, when you feel moments of overwhelming fear or anxiety, it's very important to see what has led to that, you know. Just the other day, I was sleeping and I woke up in like a really, you know, bad mood, but I didn't understand what was triggering it. And then I realized, you know, instead of me lashing out and being upset and angry, I was like, okay, let me think of what, you know, could possibly have caused this. And I realized that earlier that day I was thinking about, you know, my parents, and something had come up and those thoughts were in my head. So when I fell asleep and I woke up, I think that those thoughts hadn't gone away. Now, on a normal circumstance, let's say a regular person would perhaps have felt that they're just mad, you know, and then they'll see someone, they'll see their child do something silly, and then they'll shout at their child thinking that that's actually what's causing their anger. But in reality, that anger was already there. And you see, you would have avoided the whole situation of yelling at the child and lashing out in anger if you already knew why you were upset in the first place and try to focus on that. So I just wanted to put that out there. More so, depression doesn't just come with things that are triggering it. Sometimes there's a combination of chemical imbalances in your brain that trigger depression. So taking care of the psychological and psychosocial aspects of depression are just as important as treating it medically. So with psychotherapy, how does this help with depression? I'm just going to give you a few points so that we get straight to the point. Psychotherapy will help you understand your behavior and the ideas and the emotions that contribute to your depressed state. So when you go for psychotherapy, you'll be able to identify your different life problems and events that could have caused your depression. Sometimes what happens is you don't know that you're feeling overwhelmed. You don't know that you're going through grief. And you don't realize that something that happened 1 year ago could still be causing the depression that you're feeling today. There are events such as major illness, death in a family, loss of job, loss of a relationship that was very important that contribute to overall depression. And therefore, as counselors, we help people understand which aspects of these problems are needed to be solved, resolved, and understood. Psychotherapy will also help you learn coping techniques, problem-solving skills, such as how do you take control of the triggers, what do you do when you come across a trigger, how do you handle it when you wake up and you're feeling even worse than you felt the night before. So that's basically what any kind of therapy or therapist is going to focus on. Moving on, there are different kinds of therapy. And when you're depressed, you need to understand that apart from yourself, there are a lot of factors around you that are affected. So individual therapy is very common for people, who maybe are scared to admit that they have depression, people who it's taken them a lot to come to depression, it's to acceptance of depression. So that's who we would advise, to go for individual therapy. Then there's group therapy, where you have 2 or more patients who are participating in therapy at the same time, and patients then are able to share their experiences, learn that other people feel the same way. And what happens with that is there's a sense of satisfaction, because I think someone had also asked, just rushing through the questions, that you feel a sense of loneliness when you have anxiety and when you have depression. It's because you believe that you're inside this little bubble. And when you're in this bubble, it's a bubble of unhappiness. And it's not easy to let people into that. It's also not easy for people to understand it. So this bubble, I always say, is not even see-through. It's like you're in just a box. People can't see what you're going through, but you're stuck in a situation of, you're not understanding what's going on in your life. So you do feel alone. And when you go for group therapy, it really, really helps, because you know that there are other people who are suffering, you know that there are other people who have overcome the suffering, And what happens with group therapy is, for example, me, because I've gone through a certain experience, I will handle group therapy about that certain experience. For example, when you go for AA therapy, which is drinking therapy, addiction therapy, you'll usually find that it's an ex-addict who's going to lead the group session. And this is because it's very important to have somebody who understands what you're going through. And as counselors, we really focus on empathy. And empathy can come from either experiencing something or even just putting yourself in someone else's shoes. The next kind of therapy is couple therapy, which helps spouses and partners understand why the other one has depression. Because when you have depression, most likely your relationships are also going to be very heavily affected. Your husband will come home, but you're going to be upset the whole time. You don't want to cook. You don't want to talk. You have a lower libido. You can't communicate properly. So when you go for couple therapy, counselors will teach you how to change your communication to be more effective, and understanding your partner's behaviors and how you can also help them cope. There's also family therapy, which pretty much works the same way as couple therapy. So I hope that answers the question on the importance of psychotherapy when you have depression. Nish?
Okay, we have a question here. Among the therapies, do you offer family therapy as a specialist? Do you offer family therapy and teletherapy? And how much do you charge?
Myself?
Yes, you.
uh, okay, currently I'm doing individual therapy. So I have a number
Okay.
of clients, and I'm actually just waiting for some certificate to come in. Once that is in, I will be beginning to offer more kinds of counseling and therapy. So for the person who's asking, if you're in the group, you have my number, and if not, I can drop my number before everybody leaves, just so that you have access to me. In about a week or two, I should be offering more than one kind of therapy. But if it comes to charges and everything, I don't have a standard charge. So I'm open to speaking if you do need therapy. And if you are having a problem and you would like to see what kind of services I offer, then please feel free to message me.
Okay, and then, and anxiety. In most cases, anxiety is normally termed as negative. So do we have positive anxiety?
So there are positives of anxiety, but generally you don't have anxiety in a positive manner, in the sense that anxiety is a disorder. And when something is classified as a disorder, it is defined as a disorder because it is causing issues, because it is altering your life in a negative aspect. However, people with anxiety are actually better at responding to threats rather than people who don't have anxiety. I don't know if maybe that would explain the positive aspect of it, because I can tell you that yes, there are positives. For example, I'm a person who has no anxiety, so I don't think twice about a lot of things I do, and it has gotten me in a lot of trouble because I don't panic. For example, like if we're caught by the cops or something like that's happening, I'm the first one to try and fix the situation because I don't have anxiety. So what happens with that is, it comes to a point where you're like, okay, I'm not worried, so I'm going to do whatever I want. So therefore, people who have anxiety are actually much better at responding to threat because their brains will process the threat more efficiently. So they will avoid fatal accidents. You will see that people with anxiety will probably drive more carefully. They will act more carefully. They will speak more carefully because they're always worried. So I hope maybe that answers kind of like the positive aspect of having anxiety.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. What's your take on OCD? But I think you can start by defining what that is.
What's my take? Okay, but there were some questions also at the top. So we'll maybe you'll just refer me back to those questions as well so we don't miss anyone's questions.
Okay.
Okay, so let me answer the OCD one. First of all, I would like to point out that OCD is known as obsessive compulsive disorder. The obsessions, sorry about that, the obsessions are the excessive thoughts that lead to repetitive behaviors, which are the compulsions, hence the name, obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's characterized by unreasonable obsessions and thoughts and fears that lead to you doing compulsive behavior. So compulsive means you won't stop doing it. It's like repetitively doing something. And it's an anxiety disorder, so it does come under anxiety. And it's what happens is you have a lot of unwanted thoughts, ideas, sensations when you have it. It's very intrusive. So when you have OCD, it's not something that you can control. Having OCD, it's how do I put it? It's like you imagine when you see something and all of a sudden everything else gets completely blacked out and all you can focus on is this one thing. So that's what obsessive compulsive disorder is. Again, my take on it is, as a counselor, I can say that with OCD, it is a very important mental illness, okay? So it's not just something that you develop overnight. It's something that you've had for a long time. It's recurrent, it's irresistible, and there are things like let's say you have to have things in certain order, you become obsessive over it, and you won't look at anything else. So it's like the whole world is blacked out and your focus is on this one thing, and you can't help it. Your brain literally shuts down when you have OCD, and it focuses on this one thing. So that's my take on OCD. If you have more questions in regards to OCD, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you. In regards to the questions that were asked earlier,
Yeah.
we have one asked, can depression be genetic?
Yes, depression can actually be genetic. So genetic,
In terms of?
Sorry? Sorry, I'm back. My microphone is having an issue. So scientists and research has shown that about 40% of people with depression, it is connected to a genetic link. So environmental factors, other factors, those things make up 60% of it, but 40% of it has to do with your genetics. So people who have parents and siblings with depression end up they have a 3 times more likely probability of getting depression as well. Because, like I said, depression it's a combination of biological and brain changes, right? So your genes is what's passed on from your parents and your family. So depression is known to run in families. Genetic factors can contribute to the risk of developing this disease, which is why if you know that your parents, your sisters, your aunties and your uncles have had depression, it's extremely important to understand that if you find out in your early stages, you can do things that will prevent you from getting depression because you already know that it exists in your brain. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. And is it normal to have anxiety over open spaces?
Yes, it is extremely open. I know that a very common type of anxiety happens over closed spaces, and you'll hear something called claustrophobia, which is anxiety of being in small spaces. But there is also a kind of anxiety that you get when you're in open spaces because large crowds can affect and can scare people. The idea of being in an open space can freak you out because it's like you're more aware of the potential threats around you. I hope that makes sense because, for example, yes, that's what it's called, agoraphobia. So I also kind of understand that because there's some situations where it's such a big crowd. It's a very open space, but there's way too many people. I can't actually function in a situation like that. I would rather be in the front of a place, but if I were to be in between a very large open space with a lot of people, that would cause a lot of anxiety. So that is a kind of anxiety.
Okay, how would you advise anyone with PTSD to deal with their issue?
So with PTSD, there are 3 kind of treatments that are recommended. So I hope everybody knows PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. So because traumatic events are very difficult to deal with and come to terms with, you have to confront your feelings, and seeking professional help is one of the most effective ways of treating PTSD. So it is possible for PTSD to be treated. The first thing you have to do, however, is go for a detailed assessment. And that's why a lot of these mental disorders, it's when people ask me questions like, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with depression? How do you deal with anxiety? How do you deal with PTSD? What I can say is, of course, there are ways to manage it on your own. However, because all of these issues are actual mental health disorders, people don't realize that these feelings are very deep-rooted. I personally, I'm working on a program that aims to offer youth counseling at a very affordable rate, mainly because it's extremely important to allow yourself and to focus on the medical aspects of your illnesses. So even with PTSD, it's very important to know that you have to go for a detailed assessment. PTSD is actually a very long-term thing. You will have mental health issues if you don't deal with your PTSD. Having PTSD and leaving it untreated can also lead to major depression, major anxiety, major like social disorders. So it's extremely important to go for an assessment. And what the assessment does, it gives the counselor a way to understand and tailor treat you and your individual needs. If you have mild symptoms of PTSD for about 4 weeks or so, there is something called watchful waiting. Now, watchful waiting involves monitoring your own symptoms to see if they're going to improve or they're going to get worse. So the reason we do this is because if you can manage it at that early stage, you will stop it from becoming a very traumatic disorder. If you can handle it and you can go and seek therapy in the first 2 to 3 weeks, you'll be able to, take care of the future PTSD that could come. We also have a combination of psychological therapies. One of them is cognitive behavioral therapy. So for PTSD, it's very important to teach you how to manage your problems by changing the way you think about it. Now, PTSD, it takes over your brain in the sense that when you have flashbacks of your traumatic experiences, you can literally stop everything you're doing. You will be really mentally affected by it, and it causes a very large domino effect, I can say. So trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy uses different psychological techniques to help you come to terms and accept what has happened, because the essence of PTSD is accepting and understanding that what has happened, and therefore once you've accepted something, you are then only able to move on. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the stages of grief, but the last stage of grief is acceptance, and it's acceptance for a reason, because when you have accepted anything, you have come to terms with it. And when you've come to terms with it, your brain has put it to ease. It's like closing a book and putting it away. You're done reading that book. Now, there's something that I just wanted to tell all of you, and I hope this helps you maybe in your daily life, but there are a lot of times where I've had months that have gone and it's just like bad thing after bad thing. And I'm sure everyone has experienced that, and it gets very exhausting. But what is something for me personally, what I like to do is I like to say, and I'm okay with it at the end of every sentence. And I started doing this very recently, but it has genuinely helped me. I can't tell you guys, as a counselor also, I obviously have my own issues and I have to go for therapy and everything. But when I say I'm okay with it, it's like whatever happens, and then you add, and I'm okay with it. You're convincing your brain that there's no room to be upset about something. There's no room to be depressed about something. And that is okay. So I'm okay with it, you have to add, I am okay with this, something happened and I'm okay with it. The moment you start telling your brain that you are okay with something, you're going to stop it from turning into a further and bigger issue. So back to PTSD, yeah, it's very important to see a therapist. It's very important for them to diagnose you, to see what level of PTSD you're at, and then therefore they can help you regain control of your fear and distress, and help you change all the negative ways that you think, all the ways that you feel like maybe you're to blame or you feel like it's going to happen again. So that's what PTSD is about. Nish?
Okay, we have a question here. In fact, I think it's a suggestion. What's the name of your organization, and can you lead them to, okay, before you wind up, you'll have to give us your contacts so that anyone who is willing to seek therapy from you is able, and yeah, they can reach you. So that's a suggestion.
Okay.
So there's a question here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry, just I'll let you continue. I wanted to say that I'm currently working on it. I am a counselor and I do have clients, but there are official steps you have to take, such as like being certified by KCPA, and there are certain like certifications that you need and everything. So I want to make sure that I have all of those kind of things first of all, And then I want to be able to create this platform or this organization. I personally am doing counseling, though. I will drop my contacts. My email address is better than phone number because I like to be more professional on platforms like this. So I will drop it, and I will tell you how to go about, if you want therapy with me, the charges and etc. So I will keep that in mind, and yeah, definitely. There's always a way to find me. So I'm here.
Okay, we have a question here. What's the role of peer support in handling depression, and how effective can it be as a combination with counseling or standalone?
Okay, so I wanted to first say, in regards to that peer thing, as a counselor, I have friends who obviously have issues, but I am not any of their therapists because it goes against our ethical code of conduct to give treatment to your friends, right? So the reason we do that is because even when you're seeking help from your friend, yes, it is very healthy. Yes, it is very good. It is very fulfilling to have a friend tell you, you're going to be okay, you're going to do it. Now, I personally am very like, I am personally very affected by my friends in the sense that, if I'm upset, that's who I go to first. However, I know as a counselor that there's a very big difference between going to a counselor and going to your friend. But that being said, having a healthy peer group is extremely important. I cannot emphasize how important it is, especially when you have depression and anxiety, to have people who understand those illnesses, to have friends who support you. For example, I want to just give a very, easy to understand example. My friend has crazy anxiety. So my friend has anxiety and she's not able to do certain things. So just because she's going to take long to do it, or just because she's not able to fulfill certain tasks on her own because of her anxiety, I need to be that friend who's patient, that understands, that accepts her for that. Because if I'm not, and I put her down and I make her feel stressed about it, her anxiety level will only go higher. So having a healthy friend group and having a healthy peer relations group is extremely important, because when you have certain friends that are not going to understand and are going to be more toxic, when you're going for therapy, that stuff is going to be in your mind. So there's no point, leaving your therapist's room and entering a toxic environment. So I hope that answers that question in relation to your peer relations.
Okay, we have Carol asking, how can you take control of the anxiety triggers? I think you gave us some 4As and maybe you could repeat it for her.
Yes, I absolutely could. So the 4 A's that I was giving are the 4 ways of managing your issues. So I said that it's avoid, adapt. Hi, sorry. I think that there was an issue with my microphone. Okay. So like I was saying, I'm just going to go over the 4 ways of managing your anxiety. The first one is to avoid. Now, a lot of times I think people feel so overwhelmed with their anxiety that they forget that there's a choice of avoiding stress, whereby you can either plan ahead, you can rearrange your surroundings, or you can eventually figure out a way to just avoid those triggers of stress. Now, if you can't do this on your own, obviously, you can look to a therapist, you can look to a friend, because there are people who are going to notice and understand and help you figure out exactly what things are triggering your anxiety. So when you know these things, you'll be able to avoid such certain situations. When I say avoid, I don't mean you're going to just stay in your bedroom all day. I mean things like, one, you can take control of your surroundings. If you know that there are certain places in town that perhaps, sorry, could you guys mute your background? So yeah, you take control of your surroundings. If you know that there are places that cause you having anxiety or triggers your anxiety, you avoid that place. If you can avoid the people who are going to bother you, such as coworkers or anyone that, like, currently, social distancing is exactly what you're trying to do, because you're trying to avoid people, because that's what's causing anxiety. You know that, okay, going outside the house is going to cause you anxiety, so you avoid doing those things. Eventually, I think when you go to a counselor, the one thing that we teach most of our clients in relations to anxiety is learn how to say no. And this is very important. And I personally don't do it because I have a really hard time saying no. I put myself into situations that I know are going to cause me stress. But that's how you understand the importance of it, because you have a lot of responsibility on yourself. You have a lot of demands. You have to find a way to balance all of these things out. So at some point, you need to know the difference between being good and being a bit foolish in regards to your own um, self-control and how you say no. The people who appreciate you, understand you, and especially the people who are around you will understand when you say no. And that's how you know, in relation again to the peer support, how you know that you have a healthy peer group or how you don't have one. Sometimes you have to alter things, and that's the second technique of handling anxiety. When you alter things, what happens with that is, sometimes you just sit there and you think, okay, I am just going to sit here and feel miserable and I'm not going to fix anything. However, you need to understand that even when you go to a therapist, you cannot go there expecting them to solve all of your issues. If you come to me, I will ask you 600 times, not 600, but I will ask you, are you sure you want therapy? Because it is very important as a counselor and as a counselee to be on the same page. So if you're willing to help yourself, then only a counselor can help you. It's basically that saying of, you can take a horse to the water, but you can't force it to drink. In the same exact way, you can come for therapy, but if you're not willing to change and alter certain things of your life, you may not actually succeed in therapy. And I don't want to sit here and be one of those people that lies and says, go to therapy and all your problems will be fixed. No, therapy is a way to guide you to fix your issues. So when you're altering things, you can do one, respectfully find a way to ask people to change. Be willing to do the same, because what people don't realize is small problems can often create a larger one if they're not fixed. So if you're tired of being a target with your friends, for example, tell them to stop. Okay. If you want something to happen more, ask for it, those kind of things. So the second thing of alteration is communicate your feelings openly. There's one technique that I really like, and I'll just mention it now. Of course, there's many, but this one is really good. It's basically remember to use I in your statements. For example, saying, I feel frustrated at your behavior. Do you mind changing it? Not starting every accusation and trying to change things by using you, because that sounds like you're attacking somebody and demanding. So for example, you and your friend are having an argument, or they're taking control over something too much. You don't start a sentence by saying, you always want to do this, you always, no. You try and say, I'm sorry, I'm busy, I don't want to do this. Or I'm sorry that I'm not comfortable with the situation, can we get out of it? So communication is very important in helping yourself and your anxiety. I have a friend who has crazy anxiety and she's very open. She's like, I can't make this phone call. Can you make it for me? Not, oh, you should do this. No, you see, there's a difference in how you handle situations. Another method, part of the 4 A's, is to accept. I did cover that quite largely earlier, but I'll go over it one more time. Sometimes in life, you have no choice but to accept certain things. For example, right now, it's, Corona has taken over your employment. I personally am not working right now and I'm finding it very difficult. But eventually, after 4.5 months, I've accepted it because I can't do anything about it. There's no new jobs, there's nothing I can do. So I've accepted it. In order to accept things, you have to, one, talk to someone. I know that when you have anxiety, it's very hard to talk about your feelings, but I accept. I'm okay with it. And being able to talk to somebody will allow those feelings to come out, and you won't be in a little bubble boxed up with your own emotions. So talk to people, tell them that I can't do this, I can do this, tell them that I feel this way, therefore, ... Another thing is forgiving. forgiving is extremely important. And there's a reason why forgiveness is so prominent in religion. And I really like to use that with my clients because I have Muslim clients, I have currently one Hindu client, and I have a few Christian clients. And the one thing I always emphasize is forgiveness is extremely important in religion for a reason. It takes a lot of energy to be angry. It causes stress, it causes anxiety, it causes depression. So letting go of things will free yourself from it. Another thing is practicing self-talk, which is also what I explained earlier. I like to end my sentences. My friend the other day was like, and we move regardless. And I have another friend who was like, you know, the one I told you was teaching me to say, and I'm okay with this. Because practicing those statements will convince your brain that there's no further damage because you have accepted the situation for what it is. And you are going to work with what the situation has handed you. Like that saying goes, when, you know, life gives you lemons, make lemonade. So it's the same situation. The last one is to adapt. Now, thinking you can't cope with something is actually one of the biggest anxiety triggers there is overall. I have done my thesis on anxiety, and I can tell you that people who have anxiety will always convince themselves that they cannot do something, that they cannot cope with something. So that's why adapting involves changing your standards or expectations. This is also very helpful in relationships, and I found that sometimes you can't force things, you know? You have to be able to change your standard and your expectation. So that's very important to understand. Adjusting your standards, practicing thought stopping is very important. So there's something called, it's just called negative thought stopping. And what happens is every time you begin a gloomy thought, you have to have an immediate reaction to it. So the moment you're like, okay, I can't do this, my exams, no, stop that thought immediately and say, okay, I'm gonna revise and I gotta pass my exam so I can graduate earlier. So the faster you can flip a moody or gloomy thought and refuse to replay this stressful anxiety situation as negative, it may eventually actually not be negative. It will cease to be negative because you're not allowing your brain to focus on the negative aspect. There's something called finding a silver lining, and it's extremely important to understand what that means. Negative thought stopping is like, the best way I can put it is flip it over, find the silver lining. No matter how bad a situation is, I promise you that if you think about it, you will find a positive at the end of it. So that's extremely important. It has helped so many of my friends who have anxiety, you know, letting people know that there's always a way, there's always a positive behind these situations. So those are the 4 A's. There's obviously a lot more techniques to handle your anxiety, and for anybody who wants more information, or we can always figure out a way to talk more about that. But I'll let Nish handle ask me the next question.
Okay, we have a statement here from Christian. Juxtapose the counselor with higher level of psychologist. What's the same? What is the difference? And what are the boundaries?
Okay. So there is a difference between psychotherapy, like psychologists and counselors. So the only difference actually is that I'm a counselor, but I study psychology. So psychology is the umbrella term for anything that is related to mental disorders or mental health. A psychologist have additional training and education in certain aspects. That is the only difference. A psychologist will be, now for example, I have done, I study currently psychology, counseling psychology. So a counselor and a therapist handles a broad variety of issues, which is why I'm able and I have the knowledge to handle certain situations. So because I've studied counseling, I am able to cover things like anxiety. I'm able to cover things like depression, relationships, sexual disorders. There's a very long list. You know, child trauma, I've covered all of that. I've covered even special needs. A psychologist is somebody who has and is able to treat a condition that perhaps a counselor cannot. And that's because a psychologist is more medically based, basically. So they have expertise in certain areas. They have the license and the ability to, I've seen a question where you asked if as a counselor, can I diagnose with medication? No, I cannot. My job would mainly be, as a counselor, to talk you through these issues, figure out how severe your depression is, work on the psychotherapy aspect of it, and then perhaps if you're not comfortable with me referring you to a psychologist or someone with a higher um, qualification, then I can work alongside somebody to get advice from them to then treat you. So that's how it works. Psychologists just have the ability to um, treat conditions that counselors maybe are not able to at a certain moment. So that is the difference between them. I hope that answers the question. There's like, it's basically specialization, yeah? Counselors are trained to provide counseling to almost anybody who seeks services. We don't focus on one area. I particularly am not focusing on any particular area at the moment. However, when I do my master's degree, I become a child psychologist if I decide to focus on child psychology. So that's the difference between me now and me then. So yeah. Nish can ask me the next one.
Can a psychologist prescribe medicine, or is it left to psychiatrists only?
A psychologist can. They can. Psychiatrists are psychologists.
Okay.
Yeah.
Seemrun,
Okay. One of us has an issue here.
Okay.
They're struggling to live a picture perfect life and just to fit the expectations of their counselor. Is that okay?
Sorry, I could not understand. Sorry, what are you saying?
One of us here is struggling to live the picture perfect life here to
Okay.
fit the expectations of his counselor. So is that okay to do that?
No, absolutely not. I will. There is someone else who also asked, what are the qualities of a good counselor? And I'll tell you this, yeah. The moment you feel like you have to do something or show something, you are already at the wrong end with your counselor, because you're not supposed to. Sorry, someone mentioned here in Kenya, no psychologists cannot prescribe. They actually do have a very good point. Here, you have to go to a psychiatrist who is clinically allowed to prescribe you medication. So even what I was saying earlier, if you were not okay with going to a psychiatrist and wanted to go through someone, there is a way around that, yes. But I cannot tell you, go and buy these medications. That is not allowed. Sorry, so I just wanted to clarify that. But yes, so when it comes to picking your counselor, the moment you feel like you have to do something, those are the key words. You are not with a counselor that is suited to your needs. Absolutely. Because I, as a counselor personally, the first thing I like to assure my clients of in the beginning, and it's the introduction, rapport building part of our meetings, is that there is no judgment. Because the moment you feel like you have to change something and live a picture perfect life because you're relating your life to your counselor or your psychologist is not doing the right thing. And I can say that very clearly, because you are not supposed to do what your counselor wants you to do. Your counselor is there to guide you to do the right things that are going to make your life better. Not, I tell you, go dump your boyfriend, move out of your house, get a job. That is not my job to say as a counselor. So the moment you feel like you have to do something to please your counselor, it's not allowed. Remember that you are paying the counselor. They are not paying you. You are the one asking for their help. They don't get to tell you what to do. So it's very important to know that the moment you are feeling even slightly uncomfortable, even slightly judged, even if it's with me, you should just leave. So I just wanted to put that. I think Harriet, did you have a question?
I just wanted to say something to add on what you're saying.
Yeah.
As psychologists or even counselors, we believe that our clients, we don't refer them as patients, since we believe that as an individual, when you come to therapy, you have solutions to your problem. It is just the counselor or psychologist to lead you on to find proper solutions to yourself. So I cannot tell you to do something that you're not willing to do. So when counseling or session reaches to a point that you have to do what the counselor is saying, that is not a right counselor for you, as you just said. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. And you're absolutely right. That's so important. You have to understand that a counselor, okay, someone has written here, and sorry, I really want to address it. It says, so that means a counselor can let you do a destructive thing, so not to overstep the limits. No. Now, that's what differentiates a good counselor from a bad counselor. I don't even want to say bad counselor because, to be honest, that's a judgment I should be passing. Let me just put it this way. That's what differentiates a counselor that is suited for you versus one that is not suited for you. You can't expect a counselor to not tell you, okay, so there's a way to handle these things. You know, your client comes in, tells you, I want to jump off a building. You are not going to sit there as a counselor just to not overstep your limits and say, okay, I don't think you should do this, but okay. No, of course not. In certain situations, we have protocols in place for destructive things. Remember, as a counselor, our job, what we are taught to do is to be very observant. We are taught to understand even things that are not being said. We're taught to pick up on what a client wants to do. So trust me, if you're going to a counselor that is qualified, that is good, that is empathetic, that has the qualities of a good counselor, they're going to pick up on the fact that perhaps you're suicidal or you're about to do a destructive thing. And it is their job to um, you know, make sure that these things don't happen. That doesn't mean they're going to tell you not to do it. But if my client tells me I'm suicidal, I'm going to find a way to get in touch with their parents. You know, usually in contracts, some clients will give you numbers, or they will, it's very optional, but they will give you access to maybe somebody else that is in their life. You will have to speak to, you know, if they're a youth, you'll go and tell their teacher, you'll go and tell their parents, because you have to. As a counselor, and as a human being, you have the moral obligation to stop someone from doing something destructive, but there is a way. You don't just jump off your chair and tell them, no, 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 you can't do this destructive thing. But you also don't just sit there and say, okay, it's fine. So I hope that kind of answers. Yeah. There is a point where confidentiality can be breached. And we mentioned this, Harriet has mentioned that. Thank you, Harriet, for that reminder. To add on to what she's just said, you know, there is in our contract, we do say that if certain things, or if not even in the contract, but just when you're talking to your client the first session, I always tell my clients that, listen, if I at any point believe that you're about to cause harm to another individual or yourself, I will have to breach this confidentiality. It's the same way where, like, if a lawyer comes to me and asks me for certain you know, advice, I'm not going to be able to just say no, because that breach of confidentiality has to happen. There's no choice about it. Sorry, you can continue asking me the question, Nish. I forgot to refer you over.
Okay, we have another question here. Talking of relationships, how can a person living with depression maintain good relationships with people who are not depressed?
Okay, just sorry, give me 1 second. I'm fixing my microphone. Okay, so earlier I had also mentioned that there is something called family counseling and couple counseling. Most importantly, there's, you know, individual counseling as well. When you are depressed yourself, when you go for therapy, it's part of the therapeutic process to teach you how to cope and how to manage your relationships with people who are not depressed. Again, it's very important to that's another thing I had addressed earlier. It's very important to have a healthy circle of friends, you know, family and everything. And when it reaches a point, for example, when you're married, see, with your friends, again, there's still distance. But when it comes to marriages and families, because of the closeness you have with these people on a daily basis, it's very important to perhaps even go for 1 or 2 or even 3 family therapy sessions, so that they can understand your emotions as the one who's depressed, and you who is depressed can also understand the effect that you are having on your family. Sometimes you also need to be reminded, this is why they're acting this way. This is, you know, a normal human reaction to your behavior. So that's extremely important. Just on that note, someone has said here, what would cause recurrent suicide thoughts? So depression does cause recurrent suicidal thoughts, because in order to reach a stage in your life where you say, okay, I want to commit suicide, you have to have gone through a lot of mental and emotional pain. So I just wanted to answer that. I think Harriet has something to say.
I didn't raise. Oh, my. Okay, what
Sorry,
I
the hand was up.
oh, it has just been up a longer period. But what I can say, maybe can't or for therapy, even treatment, by saying sometimes they lack insight, but through the intervention of drugs, when they are stable, they can come for counseling. They will be given insight therapy about what they are educated on, ways of coping and strategies and ways of creating boundaries that will be so healthy and even help them work and be functional again. Kwa sababu most of mental illnesses affect our emotional well-being, spiritual, family, even workplaces. Therapy is important in managing depression. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input as well. So yeah, insight therapy is extremely important. Sorry, Nish, maybe you could continue. Just, I think there's still questions up at the top. I don't want to miss anything. Nish? Yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, just maybe you could check if there's any more questions.
We don't have any other question.
Okay. So if there's no more questions, I just want to continue just saying with this. If there are questions, and I noticed that people do have a lot of questions in relation to mental health, especially in this topic, I will drop my email address down. I am very quick to answer my emails, so don't feel like, okay, if I email her, she's never going to check or answer. I'm going to drop my email address down. Also, if you're part of the Sikhi youth group, I'm available at all times to answer questions. And if I can't answer one immediately, I will take some time, but I will answer it. However, also perhaps you could drop more suggestions on specific things you want to talk about. And even if we keep our presentations to maybe an hour, I'm suggesting, instead of 2 hours, just to cover specific topics. Because I've noticed, like, for example, a lot of you had questions about counseling itself, more than like just only depression and anxiety. So let's say you have a topic such as counseling or counselors or whatever, just drop the suggestion. We can organize a time in the evening and we just have 1 hour of focusing on that particular topic, because my aim here is obviously to reach as many of you as I can. And so that's my suggestion. I think you can talk to Nish, you can talk to me, and there's other people who can handle that situation. So I just wanted to put that. I am going to leave my contact, and yeah, before we leave. So I'm just going to drop that right now.
Okay, thank you so much. And I hope the session was educative and interactive for everyone. Yes, she's going to be giving out her contacts and you can reach to her. Okay, next week, Saturday, we're going to still be meeting at 3 p.m. and we'll be giving you the topic early in advance. So have a nice evening, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was a pleasure speaking to all of you. Like I said, you can just drop any of your inquiries, and I will, in a very short time, I will have more information in regards to professional counseling with me. So I'm looking forward to speaking to all of you whenever I can. Thank you.